Howdy, Fullmetal Cowboy, straight shooting a review of the film The Great Mouse Detective. This is the 26th Disney animated film. It was released in 1986 and directed by 4 people who are Ron Clements, Bernie Mattinson, David Michener, I apologize if I mispronounce his last name, and John Musker. The reason I read off their names on my phone is because I did not want to do a bunch of takes just to get it right. Now, seeing as how this is an animated film about a mouse detective living in England, it would be easy to assume that this film draws heavily from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work on the Sherlock Holmes stories. And that is exactly the case here. However, this is not the direct source that this film is adapting from. What The Great Mouse Detective is really adapting from is a series of children's books titled Basil of Baker Street by Eve Titus, which draws heavy inspiration from Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories. Instead of having Sherlock Holmes as the character, we have a rodent living underneath Sherlock's house that is essentially a rodent version of Sherlock Holmes. And I must say, while it draws heavily from the Sherlock Holmes stories, it's nice that Eve Titus was really creative with the concept of a rodent version of Sherlock Holmes. And the same applies to Dr. Watson and, of course, Moriarty. It's no wonder why the Sherlock Holmes stories are well known today, because after all, it's easily the best known detective fiction out there. And it's because of the legacy of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's work that I'm perfectly fine with something like a kid-friendly version of Sherlock Holmes, but instead of people, it's rodents. Even throughout the 2010s, there have been 2 notable television adaptations of Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock, the BBC modernized adaptation starring Benedict Cumberbatch as Sherlock Holmes, and the American television adaptation titled Elementary. And I'm only giving Sherlock and Elementary a mention because I'm not going to disclose anything further about those 2 shows other than I've already mentioned them. Now, let's talk about this film in particular. As time has gone by, The Great Mouse Detective has been getting a lot more respect out of Disney animated films around this time period, given the fact that The Great Mouse Detective premiered 3 years before The Little Mermaid did, in which that film kicked off the Renaissance era of Disney animated films. But you know what? There are certain qualities about The Great Mouse Detective that I think kickstarted what the Disney animated films were going to be capable of. Throughout my years of experiencing Disney animated films, I never saw The Great Mouse Detective when I was a kid. In fact, I never even owned the film on VHS. And the same applies to my teenage years. I didn't even get a chance to watch that. And the first time I ever watched The Great Mouse Detective was back in late 2019. And after experiencing The Great Mouse Detective for the very first time, the first thing that came to my mind is, it must be a mystery why not many people recommended this film to me, because after having seen it, I loved every second of The Great Mouse Detective. The animation in The Great Mouse Detective is, for the lack of a better word, great. And it's also presenting late-stage xerography, which at this point in time in the Walt Disney Animation Studios history, this was one of the last few films to use xerography as an animation process. And out of all the Disney animated films that use xerography, The Great Mouse Detective is the most refined presentation of xerography I have seen in a Disney animated film. Now, what about the songs that one would expect out of a Disney animated film? There is one song in The Great Mouse Detective that actually does stand out amongst the rest, and that is the song titled The World's Greatest Criminal Mind, which, of course, that song is about Ratigan. Speaking of which, I may have experienced little of the work that Vincent Price has delivered throughout his lifetime, because all I've experienced from the guy was his involvement in the Michael Jackson song Thriller and his performance as Ratigan in The Great Mouse Detective. But because of those two particular areas, now I really want to experience more of his work, because I love every second that Vincent Price has in this film. I just love how deliciously evil that Vincent Price sounds as Ratigan, and that's why I enjoyed every second of it! Besides Vincent Price being the standout performer in The Great Mouse Detective, I will spotlight another actor, Barry Ingham, as the titular main character, Basil, which clearly is a nod to the actor Basil Rathbone, who had played Sherlock Holmes. Now, what about the character of David Q. Dawson, the rodent equivalent of Dr. John Watson? He's voiced by Val Benton, who is best known for voicing David Q. Dawson in The Great Mouse Detective. And a few years down the road, he also was known for voicing the Sultan in the direct-to-home video sequels of Aladdin, including the Aladdin animated series. Well, The Great Mouse Detective was 3 years before the Renaissance era started, and this seemed to prove that Disney was going to go into new horizons. So I guess there might have been a good point to bring up that little information about who this actor played a few years after this, but this really has nothing to do with The Great Mouse Detective. It just has to do with this one actor. But hey, both Aladdin and The Great Mouse Detective were Disney animated films, so there's at least some relation there. Here's a fun fact. Basil Rathbone is the voice of Sherlock Holmes in The Great Mouse Detective. But the thing is, Basil Rathbone passed away in 1967. And The Great Mouse Detective was released in 1986. When this film was released, Basil Rathbone had been dead for 19 years. So, how did Disney make it possible to have Basil Rathbone's voice used? Simple. There was an audio recording of Basil Rathbone for a Sherlock Holmes story. And that's exactly what they used. They used an archived recording of Basil Rathbone to provide for a few lines of Sherlock Holmes in The Great Mouse Detective. And I find this to be a respectful tribute to Basil Rathbone, who was best known for playing Sherlock Holmes in a number of films based off Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's stories of Sherlock Holmes. Now, seeing as how the numerous adaptations of the Sherlock Holmes stories have characters we all recognize regardless of which adaptation we saw, the same does apply to The Great Mouse Detective. Most of us probably already know who Sherlock Holmes is as a character, and we see that represented in Basil. Most of us probably already know of Dr. John Watson, and that's represented with David Q. Dawson. Most of us recognize who Moriarty is as a nemesis to Sherlock Holmes, and that is well represented in The Great Mouse Detective. Even the housekeeper, Mrs. Hudson, was represented well in The Great Mouse Detective as Mrs. Judson. The only well-known character in the Sherlock Holmes stories that was represented in the Basil of Baker Street books, but did not make it in The Great Mouse Detective, was the character of Irene Adler, who in the Basil of Baker Street books was represented as Mademoiselle Relda. Mademoiselle Relda did not make it in The Great Mouse Detective, but is in the books. And I do think that's a bit of a bummer, but in this case, with what this film was working with, I am fine that this character was cut out for this adaptation. And while I think that The Great Mouse Detective has a great villain in it, I also love Basil as well, and he has his moments to shine too. And now I come to the simple deduction as to why The Great Mouse Detective has not been talked about as much in comparison to Disney animated films that came before and since. It's not as highly marketed as some of the well-known Disney animated films before and since. So we have the Golden Age films gaining a lot of attention, as well as the Renaissance film gaining a lot of attention. But not this one. There is a certain philosophy I have towards entertainment that I'm sure a number of people share the same sentiment. And that is, just because something is popular doesn't always mean that it has great quality overall. Now, while The Great Mouse Detective is not as heavily popular as some of the well-known Disney animated films before its release, in The Great Mouse Detective's case, it's one of those Disney animated films that gains more respect as time passed since its initial release. And given the time that this came out and what would follow 3 years later, I really think The Great Mouse Detective opened the door for a bright future that Disney at the time was heading into. And of course, I gotta talk about the Big Ben climax in The Great Mouse Detective, which I think is one of the best climaxes in a Disney animated film. And it's also notable for having some early use of CGI. The Great Mouse Detective is also not without at least one minor hiccup that is very obvious if you hear it very carefully. And it's this part right here.
Basil, look out!
And I'm willing to excuse this little hiccup because it really is not a detriment to the film that much, and I find some fun in spotting stuff like this. In my opinion, The Great Mouse Detective is one of the greater Disney animated films out there, and it is a strong favorite of mine. As I said earlier at the beginning of this review, I loved every second of The Great Mouse Detective. So, with that said, your deduction of what my rating of The Great Mouse Detective is going to be is pretty simple. So, to the people that love this animated film, here's this clip for you.
Smile, everyone.
And that is my review of The Great Mouse Detective, and once again, I do want to point out that there are inconsistencies with this review, but this time it's mostly because of the volume of my voice. My batteries died on me again, so I had to recharge at least one of them to finish this review, and during that process, my brother came back home, so that's why. And again, this is a quick draw cut of a review that I originally wasn't meant to present it like this, but I want to put this up for the time being given how delayed this review has been. And once I get the intended cut of this review out, of course this quick draw cut will be viewed as obsolete, but as I stated before, I'm not going to delete the quick draw cuts of specific reviews I'm releasing. I'm just going to keep them on my channel for archival sake. So now that I've reviewed The Great Mouse Detective, now I can move on to the Renaissance era of Disney animated films, and what kick-started that was The Little Mermaid. Now, this review in particular has been long delayed. In fact, I intended on releasing that review back on December 2nd because a friend of mine has a birthday on that day, and she is very fond of The Little Mermaid. So I want to get that review out at long last. It's quite overdue. So with that said, I'll be relearning for my next review, so until then, see you later.